Well, it is February after all, but that doesn't mean Josh Pate has to say something this ridiculous about the Big 12.
You are Locked On College Football with Spencer McLaughlin, your daily podcast on all things college football. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On College Football. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view every day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your daily source to stay up to date with the biggest stories in this, the greatest sport on planet Earth. Penn State's schedule is not as easy as the Nittany Lions would perhaps like it to be. And does Washington State, have a path to be this year's Indiana? That's all coming up on today's show. You never know, folks. But first, Drake 12 is here. That's what I'm calling him now. His real name, Drake Toll, Locked On Big 12. But Drake 12 has a nice flow to it. So recently, CBS Sports' Josh Pate, who I think does a great job over on his show, laid out a completely ridiculous opinion in which he said, well, because of high school recruiting rankings, the Big 12 basically isn't a power conference. Oh, boy.
You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
He's getting towards the second one, isn't he? He is not yet holding Jim Gordon's kid hostage to make a point, but I tell you what, the Joker is there at his bedside, and he is really pondering whether or not he should go over.
Jim Gordon's kid, isn't that why Mike Leach got fired from Texas Tech?
Okay, well, now that we're way off the rails, so his argument was predicated on high school recruiting rankings, and I understand where he's coming from. I think it would be in the Big 12's best interest if they could land a higher caliber player on average and more of them. I'm not disputing that. Here's what Josh Pate left out with that particular comment, though, that needs to be addressed. The transfer portal is a thing, Drake.
Yeah.
This has balanced the scales considerably. Because if you're saying the Big 12 isn't a power conference, how did the Big 12 champion just go toe-to-toe and should have beaten the SEC champion? How exactly does that happen? Because it's one thing to say, well, Boise State was in the playoff. They were competitive. Yeah, that was the best group of five team, not just in the Mountain West, but anywhere in the country. You put that up against a lower level team in a conference, that's a different argument there. But I just watched the Big 12 champion be one play away from beating the SEC champion. I mean, he's off his rocker with this one, right?
The more important question for me becomes, do you want an 18-year-old blue chip, the number 28 player in the country, or a fifth year who started for 3 seasons at Western Kentucky and was 4th in the nation in interceptions? I would rather have the guy who's 22 years old, has college football experience. What we need to be talking about is where the Big 12 falls as this almost like middle area of the transfer portal, which is exactly where you want to be. We're not seeing a lot of Big 12 wide receivers, quarterbacks, Will Howard being an exception, who are going from their universities as the guy to the SEC or the Big 10. We're seeing the opposite, actually. We're seeing a good portion of SEC quarterbacks, Big 10 quarterbacks, who either didn't get their shot or did and got washed up, KJ Jefferson, who want to go play in the Big 12. That is the same for a MAC player of the year like Taquan Finn, who wants to compete at a higher level. Where do they go? The Big 12. They don't make the jump to the SEC or the Big 10, seeing as,
Curtis Rourke is a notable exception in there. He went Ohio to Indiana. That went pretty well.
No doubt. And for a guy like that going to Indiana, he effectively went to a Big 12 school. I mean, there are schools that will also fall themselves into that little median where you say, you know what? Indiana is not the brand of a Michigan. It's not one of those top 20 brands in college football. These guys are These guys are falling into that middle ground of 20 through 40. Your Texas Techs, your Indianas, those schools, your Syracuse, they're going to benefit from having, high caliber conference play, chance to play in the college football playoff, but also you don't have to go play at Alabama where you might be behind that blue chip 5-star kid who's 22nd in the country and already has a Porsche and a $2 million NIL deal. We don't care anymore about high school. We don't care who's top 5. A&M's been number 1 for like 8 out of the last 10 years, and they still can't win.
Okay, so the A&M point is forever and always valid that if you don't have the proper coaching to maximize that talent, then it doesn't matter. I am not in the recruiting rankings don't matter area. But to just make the statement that, well, they're really not even a power conference anymore when their conference champion just went toe-to-toe with the SEC conference champion.
Yeah.
Like that's where I have a serious objection, because here I've even got numbers to prove it. I know this is a novel concept.
Before you go numbers, I hate facts, by the way.
I know.
Before you go with your logos here, I like Josh Pate. I know it's February. I know everybody's numbers are down. But why would you even say this? Everyone's loved you. You're like the John Fanta of college football. Silly, goofy guy, says stuff, and everybody's like, you know what? Cool. Uncle Josh Pate. We can get behind it. He's usually pretty down the middle. But why would you even do this? What is the point here? Give me your stupid numbers.
All right, here are the stupid numbers, because from a talent acquisition standpoint, his argument doesn't even hold up in the same way that he presented it, because what he went to is, well, the SEC's got 27 of 32, or SEC or Big Ten have 27 of 32 five-star players in the class of 2025. They have all the top 25 recruiting classes. The Big 12 doesn't have any. But wait a minute. Are we now saying the ACC is different than the Big 12? Because those two usually get cupped together, understandably so. If you asked me to power rate the best conferences in the country, I'd probably go SEC 1, SEC, Big 10, and then there's a gap between the next one. But to say that they're not a power conference or that this isn't evening out, I don't buy that, and here's why. In the composite talent rankings for 24/7 Sports, which combines high school portal or high school recruiting and the transfer portal, you've got Texas Tech at number 23, and then you have Colorado just so far behind at number 27, TCU at number 31. But I'm presuming he feels the same way about the ACC, which was definitely not as good of a football league this past year as the Big 12, certainly not as deep as the Big 12 was. And they've got Miami at 13, Florida State 18, Georgia Tech 22nd, Clemson 29. You know who's number 24 right now in the overall team talent acquisition for the 2025 cycle?
North Carolina.
Kentucky.
Bang.
Kentucky. Is anybody in their right mind going to look at Kentucky and say, well, they'd go and win the Big 12?
Lane Kiffin. Lane
Kiffin probably would. Lane Kiffin probably would. You're right. And in the transfer portal rankings, you have the same sorts of, shall we say, oversights on Pate's part here. Colorado 26th, Texas Tech 3rd, Kansas 24th, UCF 28th, West Virginia 30th. There are 5 ACC teams in the top 30 here. So yes, the high school recruiting rankings still matter 100%. But to say that that's the only metric you should look at for where's the most talent in the country, I don't buy that.
No, not at all. And I'm glad that you brought up all of these numbers, but can I give you another thing that I think is more important to me? Wins and losses. Let's look at Oklahoma State playing Arkansas, the worst team in the Big 12, going away. Like they really fought hard to be the worst team in a long time in the Big 12 conference since those Kansas squads. They still beat an SEC team this season, coming back from down 3 touchdowns. Talk about I talk about that 20-40. Illinois beating South Carolina, and then Shane Beamer is like, oh, SEC is so much better than everybody else. There are plenty of examples of SEC schools, as you already mentioned, Texas and Arizona State, going up against Big 12 schools and either losing or playing really close, good battles. Go back 2 years to Kansas State, and we beat A&M, we beat LSU. Like, it's just Rolodex year in and year out of bowl games that the SEC is like, well, we didn't want to be there. The Big 12 team wins. In the modern era of college football, you can give all the recruiting stats, but let's look at wins and losses here. The SEC has spent the last 2 years outside of the national championship race. The Big 12 was there as recently as the SEC was there, with TCU taking on Georgia. We won't talk about the final score. The Big 12 cannot be considered a group of 6 or 7, or however many Pate wants to make it, conference, because they're going toe-to-toe with the SEC in the actual games. Not just, okay, fine. The last 20 years, the SEC has led in recruiting and they've led in the NFL
100%.
draft. That's great. I'm not going to argue that. What I will say feels pretty objective is the Big 12 is still a power conference unless you're one of those people that subscribes to a Power 2. Then we can open a conversation of, yes, there are 2 conferences that are much further ahead than the others.
Just not as far ahead as I think they would proclaim to be, as we have seen time and again. Drake 12, everybody, as always. Penn State schedule in one of those Power 2 conferences, quote unquote. Yeah, that's not going to be the easiest thing to navigate. But hey, Penn State's got the horses, right? First, this episode brought to you by Wayfair. After the holiday hustle, there's nothing like giving your home a little TLC. I always find that decluttering and refreshing my space helps get me back into a routine, which I'm a big fan of. Whether you're tidying up, clearing out, or just want to give your space a new look, to start the year, Wayfair has everything you need, and all within your budget. So if you're looking on their furniture page, they've got a huge selection. It's easy to find whatever style you're looking for, whatever price range you are looking for as well. And the best part, free and hassle-free delivery, even for the larger items. Wayfair's site, super easy to navigate. You'll find exactly what you're looking for in no time. There's something for every style and every home, and Wayfair makes it easy to tackle your New Year's home goals. So check out Wayfair. Give your home the refresh it needs with Wayfair. Head to wayfair.com right now. That's WAYFAIR.com. Wayfair, every style, every home. So Penn State, the longtime bridesmaid but never the bride to the college football playoff, gets their chance in the 12-team format and makes the most of it. And I don't know they're going to be in the same position going into next year. So they have as much returning high-end talent as anybody in college football, maybe more than anybody in college football. Texas would have an argument for that as well. But I think Texas lost more from this past year's team than Penn State did, even though Penn State lost Abdul Carter. But this schedule for Penn State, I got to tell you guys, I think there's serious value on Penn State under 10.5 wins. They just went 11-1. Great season. By all account, by any measure. They lose the Big Ten championship game to Oregon. They lose at home to Ohio State. And those are the only teams that knock them off until they face Notre Dame. They lose by 3 in the college football playoff semifinal. They could make a run to get there again. Heck, they could go 10-2 with this schedule, wind up with a home playoff game. It'd be really easy to do that. But Penn State is going to be utterly uninteresting as a football team from a national standpoint until September 27th. What happens on September 27th, Spencer? I'm so glad you asked. That's when Oregon makes the cross-country trip to Happy Valley. And I got to tell you, if that ends up being a whiteout game, some Oregon uniform combination with the backdrop of a Penn State whiteout, I have long been on record saying I don't love all the realignment stuff because I think it has torn at many of the things that make college football great, the very fabric of the sport in some ways. I won't deny there are benefits, and that is one of them right there. Heck of a matchup, a rematch of the Big Ten championship game from this past season. So the good news for Penn State is that is a scheduling benefit and a half. Not only does Oregon have to go all the way across the country, obviously, you're not playing this as a neutral site game in conference play. I hope we never get to that point. But Oregon is playing a game the week before. Penn State, on the other hand, is not. So you've got Oregon with the long trip and Penn State at home off a bye. Boy, that sets up for a signature regular season James Franklin win. But again, their first three games, are really not that interesting. Nevada, FIU, Villanova. Those are 3 wins, easy money, no questions asked. Then they go at UCLA, then they host Northwestern. Again, I'm not going to be super interested in those games because we have a proven track record here with James Franklin. He is going to beat those teams. He is not going to be upset by a team that isn't any good. He only loses, right, to the high-end teams, which is a heck of a criticism for a head coach to have to deal with, but alas, that is the life that James Franklin leads. Well, you can't beat the best teams. You only beat, good to great teams, but never the best. Like, okay, I don't know how many teams win those games, but all right. So then it starts to get interesting. They go at Iowa on October 18th. I don't know how good Iowa's going to be. No Caleb Johnson. That's again a game that is more interesting than, say, Northwestern or UCLA to me, but that one will have my attention. I expect Penn State to win, 100%. Then they have a bye before they go to the biggest game on their schedule. Yes, even bigger than the Oregon game, which is at home, at Ohio State. A game that I have argued in the past on this very show, Penn State is capable of winning. because of the core of returners they have and how much turnover you are going to have for the Buckeyes. Now, if I were Penn State, this kind of applies to Oregon as well. I would almost rather flip the Ohio State and Oregon games, because who are you more afraid of? Ohio State or Oregon? Well, that answer should probably be Ohio State, given that they're the reigning national champs. They've beaten Penn State many a times. Ryan Day knows James Franklin very well. There are a lot of reasons there why the answer is Ohio State. The team that's playing Penn State later in the season will have had that many more games to rep their new quarterback. For Oregon, that's likely to be Dante Moore. For Ohio State, that's probably going to be Julian Sayin. I say that with that tone because that's not as surefire of a thing it appears as Dante Moore being the starting quarterback for the Ducks. So that game being a heck of a way to kickstart the month of November in Columbus, that's going to be a physical Big Ten battle, college game day. I'd be hard-pressed to see how they aren't there, especially if Penn State has already beaten Oregon. They'll be ranked inside maybe even the top 3. Heck, Penn State could be the number 1 team in the country at that point in time for all we know. But that Ohio State game is huge. Then they come back home against Indiana, who, if you tuned in earlier this week to my segment with Jacob Goins of Locked On Hoosiers, he believes Indiana is going to be an even better team this year. But Penn State's at home. I lean Nittany Lions, but that's not a game that I'm writing off as a win as easily as UCLA or Northwestern, for instance. But here's the interesting. They close the season with Nebraska, and then they go at Rutgers. I'm circling Saturday, November 15th at Michigan State. I am so interested in a Michigan State team that went 5-7 in Jonathan Smith's first year after getting completely and utterly decimated by the transfer portal. That roster, with injuries as well as the season went along, had no business being as good as they were. And they weren't very good. But that is a really good coaching staff that has experience punching above their weight in a power conference against a team that's got higher rated recruits, better players, more NFL guys. And going into year 2, I expect Michigan State to be able to take a step forward. I don't know how big that step's going to be, but I expect there to be some sort of step. If this game were in Happy Valley, I wouldn't worry about it quite as much from a Penn State standpoint. But at Michigan State and East Lansing, their big win last year was against Iowa. I'm not saying Iowa and Penn State are in the same category of team. They are not. Penn State's significantly better. But East Lansing is a place that it heats up. You get some people there. It gets a little loud. It can get uncomfortable. That's the middle of November. It's going to be harder to throw the football. Now, the good news is Penn State should have a really good offensive line and a couple of really good running backs. But we have seen Drew Aller struggle in big games before, and though he has an NFL caliber arm, it's always harder to play quarterback when the weather's just a little bit more frigid. It's one of the many reasons the Big Ten is known as a more defensively oriented conference, at least from where I'm sitting. So those 3 games, Oregon, at Ohio State, at Michigan State, I wouldn't be shocked if Penn State loses any of them. I also wouldn't be shocked if they win 2 or maybe even 3 of them. But are they going to go undefeated on the road this year? If you look at Penn State's win total on FanDuel and you're of the gambling ill, then you look at 10.5 and say, well, I don't believe they can go in and beat Ohio State. That's not what James Franklin does. Okay, so now you're just banking on Penn State losing to either Oregon, at Iowa, or at Michigan State. By the way, Penn State needed a fake punt to win at Minnesota this year, who was quietly an 8-win team in the Big Ten. So I've seen a lot crazier things happen. And then you just toss the Indiana wild card in there. If they're actually a better version of themselves next season, all I'm saying, that Penn State schedule does not make it as easy as the roster makes it seem to just rinse and repeat, run it back, and get the same win totals a year ago. It's going to be tougher, and the season can't get here soon enough. It's February, and I miss college football badly, but that's why I talk about it every day here on the show. So, speaking of Indiana, could we have an outside, different version of Indiana next year? Is that team up in Pullman, Washington? Say what now? Washington State's new head coach, Jimmy Rogers, is trying to be Curt Cignetti at Indiana. And you know what? There are a lot worse coaches in college football to try to emulate in your first season. So you may view Washington State as a Power 4 program. You may not. You may view them as not a G5, but not a Power 4. They're in this weird limbo kind of area, like in Inception, when they get thrown into the depths of despair of a guy's mind. And maybe that's where Washington State is right now. At least from a conference affiliation and conference membership standpoint, they've got more clarity than they did, 365 days ago around this time. But Washington State in 2025, get ready, hold on to your hats, ladies and gentlemen, is going to have 57 new players, and 22 of them are transfers. They have signed 35 kids in the class of 2025. 10 have already enrolled. 25 are probably not far behind them. 57 new players. Now, that becomes a requirement when you have the sort of portal exodus as Washington State did when Jake Dickert walked out the door and went to Wake Forest to be the Demon Deacons head coach. But 57 new, that's a big number. Now, Rogers comes to Pullman, their head coach, from South Dakota State, where he was a part of a couple of national championships, and though their rival North Dakota State took back the FCS title this past season, they were really good, and they were in the Final Four once again. And so that core group of players just had a successful run at a lower level of competition, perceived, but accurate as well. And now they're all going to follow their head coach to a program that doesn't have huge recruiting prowess, that is trying to become something that they haven't really been in a long time, if ever before. Washington State's got more of a winning tradition than Indiana did prior to Curt Cignetti's arrival. And their head coach is taking a bunch of guys from his previous stop. How interesting. There are 22 transfers going to Pullman in this 2025 recruiting cycle. Do you know how many are coming from South Dakota State? 16 of them. And that's not even including the quarterback. Mark Gronowski was maybe going up to Washington State. He's at Iowa now. And Washington State's quarterback in the Holiday Bowl, Zevi Eckhouse, he was going to, I apologize if that's not how you pronounce his first name, but Eckhouse was good in that game, put up great numbers, 31 of 43, 363 yards, 3 touchdowns, 2 picks. He was going to go in the transfer portal, and then Gronowski was in the transfer portal, and you thought, this is just going to be a part of the flow. They're going to go with. Nope. Eckhouse withdrew from the portal, and it looks like it's his starting job. Very John Mateer-esque, waiting in the wings. Plenty of potential, little bit of a gunslinger, can run. He had 28 yards on the ground and a touchdown as well in that Holiday Bowl defeat, in which there were, 0 coordinators or head coaches available there to coach them in that game. That they did as well as they did was, frankly, pretty darn impressive. But Washington State has that same sort of formula. A quarterback coming from, a roster rather, coming from a previous stop of a lower level of competition. But here's what you have to remember. Curt Cignetti took all of those guys, 16 of them, or 13, beg your pardon. He brought 13 guys from James Madison to Indiana. I can readily make the case, and I think I wholeheartly believe, the jump from JMU in the Sun Belt to the Big Ten, even with Indiana's favorable schedule, is a far more considerable size in jump than it is going from South Dakota State and one of the premier FCS programs to Washington State, who, by the way, is not playing a Mountain West adjacent schedule this year. That's not what they and the Beavs are doing. They have cobbled together their own schedule. They're playing each other twice with a handful of Power 4 games. So this is just a wildly fascinating situation to follow going into next year, because the Cougs at one point in time, remember, were off to a hot start, had a win over Washington, had a win over Texas Tech, who we know was a really good team this past season, and they were pushing towards playoff contention. But as was the theme the last 2 years under Jake Dickert's tutelage, they fell off in the second half. And then it all came apart, and they had some bad losses, including one at home to Wyoming. So that is what Washington State fans are hoping Jimmy Rogers can bring as an elevated part of his coaching style is, hey, we know the potential's there, and you can beat these teams early in the year, but can it be sustained? Is it a cold weather thing? Is it a coaching thing? Don't know. There are a million different explanations you can go for. Certainly cold weather is not going to bother Jimmy Rogers coming from South Dakota State, where it is frigid. It is a frozen tundra out there. So they're trying to be Indiana. Could they be a playoff team? It's not inconceivable. They would have to wildly punch above their weight. But they are going to have a schedule that will provide them that opportunity. They play the Apple Cup at home, by the way, going for their second straight win in the series. I'm glad that's back to a home and home, none of this neutral site nonsense with rivalry games, my goodness. But they play Washington on September 20th. Then they bounce around with a variety of group of 5 teams. Did you know that Washington State will play at Ole Miss on October 11th? And the following week, go to Virginia and play Oregon State twice. Look, I have seen Ole Miss lose to inferior football teams before. Not Washington State, with a roster of guys that were just playing FCS football the year prior. But I saw them lose to Kentucky last year, and that was not a good football team. Not a good football team at all. So I'm not putting a ton of stock in the idea that Washington State gets themselves to the playoff. But when they start to kind of circle the wagon of being a top 25 team or make that sort of run, if it's firing on all cylinders as Curt Cignetti had it early on, you got a quarterback that shows some real potential. I'm just saying, watch out for him. Virginia and Ole Miss, you better watch out. You better not cry because Washington State is coming to town. And those are not games that a lot of people probably have on their radars. But Power 4 matchups, that's essential for the Beavs and Cougs. Oregon State will have some opportunities as well. So those games against Oregon State could be resume boosters. You never know. You just never know. If I had predicted Indiana to start 10-0 last year, you would have called me wild and crazy. So that's where I leave the Coug fans today. Appreciate everyone listening. I will see you next time. And until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.